He does miss you when you're not here.
Tony Stark has always had issues with his father, but what if his issues with his father are even more complicated? What if he also had issues with his stepfather because he's Peggy Carter's son? Before comic books became the realm of spandex and bad guy punching, they had more in common with soap operas than punch-em-ups. And some of that past is rubbed off on modern comics, so surprise family relations aren't new, including the possibility that Peggy Carter is Tony Stark's real mother. Let's take a look at how that could happen and what it might mean. The idea that the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree is particularly true for Tony Stark and his father Howard Stark. Howard Stark was a genius that built the technological foundation of S.H.I.E.L.D. and eventually even the Avengers. Tony Stark was a genius who built a power suit in a cave with a car battery. They're both also willing to tell you exactly how smart they are, whether you asked or not. Tony Stark is a bit of a ladies' man, with a Vanity Fair reporter doing a spread on him in the first movie before he finally accepted that Pepper Potts was the love of his life. Howard Stark was famous for his romantic adventures to the frustration of mostly everyone. One of the people he frustrated was Super Agent Peggy Carter. Peggy was on hand when Steve Rogers made the transition from scrawny, determined Steve Rogers to super buff Captain America, and Howard and Peggy were together when that super soldier aimed his airplane into the ice. Afterwards, the elder Stark and Carter go on to form S.H.I.E.L.D. and have a long working relationship. Peggy had one thing that made her distinct from the rest of the women in Howard Stark's life. She had his respect. That didn't keep Stark from playfully testing the romantic waters with Peggy with some flirtation, but when your romantic competition is Captain America, you kinda know that your chances aren't great. That's before Captain America seems to die in the Arctic, though. Carter does have a bit of a moment with an agent named Sousa, but the ghosts of the past are hard to forget, especially if that lost love hops in a time machine, but more on that later. It's possible that this mutual respect among overachievers could result in a tender moment between the two under the when Harry met Sally rule that men and women can't be friends without eventually hooking up. Which is silly, but also a movie, and these are comic book movies. Everything's heightened. Remember the romance story connections for comic books. Could Peggy have decided to let Stark raise the young Tony with Maria Stark after Peggy and Howard had a romantic moment? It wouldn't be the strangest thing to have happened in comics. Before we get too far along, though, there's a lot of very specific holes to fill. We know from the time-traveling shenanigans and basic math that Tony Stark was born in the early 70s. In Endgame, Tony Stark is meeting his father as he rushes home to a pregnant wife, presumably Maria Stark. Arguably, this theory is done there before the crib is even built. But you're not thinking like a soap opera. We don't actually know what baby that is that Maria's carrying. We assume it's Tony because Tony doesn't have any MCU siblings that we know about, but Maria could have miscarried that child while an emotionally weak and vulnerable Howard turns to an old friend during that loss. One thing leads to another, and Maria and Howard are now raising a young Tony Stark, son of Howard Stark and Peggy Carter. Though then there is the issue of Schrodinger's Captain America. If you talk to the writers of Endgame, Peggy Carter's mysterious husband has always been Captain America, that he just slipped back through time to get that dance he missed. If that's the case, then this is a moment of weakness for her as well as Howard. Perhaps Rogers was out heroing or they were separated for some other reason. Maybe Steve knew that this is when he came back, and in order to not disrupt the timeline, he left without explanation. Even if you side with the Russo brothers who say that Cap went to an alternate timeline, Peggy, and used his wrist time thing to come back to this reality to pass on his shield, there's still the matter of Peggy's husband and kids. Though there's any number of reasons for that to not have been a factor. This would have some far-reaching implications, both personally and more broadly. Tony's issues with his father would be complicated by him being Peggy's son and Howard not being able to tell Tony. It would also explain why Tony's mom would have a hard time healing that rift between the two. Though he wouldn't know it, when Steve Rogers unknowingly kissed his niece, it would also mean that he kissed Tony's cousin. Just some weird family tree things there. It would also make Peggy Carter practically the mother of the MCU. Not only does she help create and train Captain America and form S.H.I.E.L.D., but she also gave birth to a founding and driving member of the Avengers in Tony Stark, who goes on to become Iron Man. She's also Morgan's grandmother, and we know Morgan is destined for big things. That's just kinda how it works in comics. This means that Tony atoning with his father also happened along with him atoning with his stepfather, as Tony Stark and Steve Rogers worked out their issues to trust each other and take down Thanos. It does mean that Tony was robbed of yet another parental experience. Peggy lived all the way up to Civil War, meaning that Tony could have had a relationship with his biological mother. He can't catch a break, aside from being a genius billionaire and playboy with a power suit. You know what? Things worked out kinda fine for him, actually. Of course, all the pieces that have to fall in place to make this happen without having a major story evolve out of it isn't particularly likely. Unless Tony was Peggy and Steve's son that Howard raised as his own? Was that picture of Peggy's kids really Tony? Well, probably not, but what fun are comic book stories without a little bit of speculation? What hidden relationship do you think exists in the MCU? Let us know in the comments, and while you're there, why not subscribe to CBR for all the latest videos? Thanks a lot for watching.